hello once again. Welcome back after coffee break. Hope that everyone had an opportunity to refresh a bit. And it's time to continue this session about student-centered learning. Right now we'll have roundtable discussion with honorable panelists about the topic. And first of all, I would like to introduce myself. I am Eigirdas Sarkanas, the president of Lithuanian National Union of Students, and for this part of the session, I will be facilitator of the panel discussion. Also, I would like to introduce other student representative from Croatia, Borna Nemet, who will be a reporter of this discussion, and at some point during the whole conference, he will make final conclusion, concrete on this part. So, some information how we will work during this part. Discussion will be divided into three parts. First of all, we will have short presentations related to the topic of each panelist. Then I will moderate discussion among panelists based on their thoughts and ideas about student-centered learning, about its values, implementation in different countries, struggles, etc. Finally, of course, you, the audience, also will have opportunity to ask questions. So now I would like to introduce and invite to take seats are already taken, our discussion panelists. First of all, National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning Director, Terry Maguire. Can we get some applause? Thank you. European Student Union former Executive Committee member and right now newly elected Vice President of ESU, Gohar Hovhannisyan. Also, researcher at Institute of Technology in Carlow, Caroline McDonnell. And last but of course not least, Bologna Follow-up Group Vice Chair, Catherine Isaacs. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, we would like to hear each of your thoughts, ideas, and simply main points of view on student-centered learning from your personal, professional perspective, and share your experience, because each of you are from different stakeholder groups and most likely will have different approaches. So, let's begin in the same order. Terry, floor is yours.
Okay. So my organization in Ireland, our job is to lead and advise the higher education sector, the universities, our institutes of technologies, and our private colleges. And I suppose our role is different because we're doing it at a national level. So we're kind of the sector and for the sector. And so the question I was asking was, how can we drive student-centered learning from a national level? So what we've done is, first of all, we started to have some of those hard conversations, and that's what I mean across the whole sector. So this morning our speakers talked about that transition from second level to higher level. And I think what we spent 2 years working with the higher education sector teasing this out, and what we actually got them to realize is that we have to stop talking about our students as second level students and higher education students. They're the same people, lads, they're just at a different time in their journey. The second big conversation we had was around assessment. And we started for nearly 3 years this conversation about getting a national understanding around assessment of, for, and as learning. And now, at least when we talk to the institutions, we have that shared understanding. And things I think, are definitely starting to progress. But if we want to actually develop student-centered learning, we need to support those who teach, but also those who learn. So the Forum has partnered with the Union of Students of Ireland, the Other Students' Union, and the wider student cohort. And we've done some shared research projects together. We've actually developed a student-led Learning Impact Award. And we've also the Forum itself has student internships to make sure that the student voice is actually heard and influences the work that we do. But we also have to work with those who teach. And this morning, the importance of the discipline and the program was actually highlighted. So what we've done is provide frameworks and thinking tools we focus on the discipline and the programs to try and get them to think about how they can enhance teaching and learning. And part of that is looking at finding ways to get them to engage in professional development. One of the things that we've done to support that is that engagement just doesn't happen. You have to build the leadership capabilities of students, and you have to work with staff and students to build those partnerships. And we have a national initiative called NSTEP, the National Student Engagement Programme, that supports our work. But the most important thing is that we need to recognize this isn't easy. Local contexts and higher education institutions are messy places. There's not a lot of time and space to be doing all this enhancement work. And it's not a matter of just saying, right, we're going to do student-centered learning. We've got to be patient. We've got to persevere. We've got to work together in partnership and realize that in the end, it will be worth it. And remember that we're smarter together.
Thank you. Then, Gohar.
Thank you. I will try to be as short and precise. But at first, I want to say how delighting it is to be here and to talk with, just sitting here with colleagues and also following the previous talks and speeches about student-centered learning of people who have such an extensive experience on working on student-centered learning, and reading whose works was such an inspiration for myself personally, and I also believe for other students who are involved into student movement. So it's just an honor to be here. And the paper that me and my former colleague, Alexander Szuszniar, who was an executive committee member during the last year in the European Student Union, we wrote this paper as a contribution to the Routledge Handbook, as Mania mentioned during her speech. And this paper, which you will have the chance, obviously, to read after 6 months when it will be published, in this paper we tried to analyze the policies on student-centered learning, and we tried to look into two dimensions of analysis at the European level, how the policy went through Bologna and also other European policy-making institutions, and also we tried to look how the European Students' Union itself pushed for student-centered learning to get into policy documents and to become a topic for policymakers to discuss and to become a topic for policymakers to think about and to give incentives from the policy level to the lower level to be implemented. And this was like a very interesting way to go through and to understand, so actually how these policies, and this was also discussed during the previous Q&A session, how actually these policies have contributed to the practical implementation. Did they actually, or did they not? And what was the students' role in it? What was ESU's role in it? And the results, we see that today, the European Students' Union holds such an amazing role in different structures, in different institutions, in different working groups, expert groups, that students at the European level can contribute to the discussions about policies on student-centered learning. And then we look into our own research and results from the Bologna with Student Eyes, where we try to look into how actually the implementation is happening at the national level or the institutional level. And we see that the voice of students in these lower levels is not really heard. And I think that's where the struggle is coming, which was discussed during the previous session, why actually this actual implementation of student-centered approach to education is lacking. So, and we see that at the student participation level as well, that student involvement into discussions about student-centered learning at the national level, at the institutional level, at the curriculum level is lacking, which means that student-centered learning is not there, and it's so far from from being a reality and being achieved. And also in this research paper, we tried to reflect, so why is this happening? So if we are talking so much about student-centered learning at the policy level, and we all at least have heard once this very amazing, fascinating term, why we still don't manage to implement it. And one of the reasons is that there are many, many misconceptions about student-centered learning, about the implementation of student-centered learning. And Mania has mentioned about those, and we have tried to go a bit deeper and understand particularly what are the misconceptions that are particularly about students and are particularly about students' approach to student-centered learning, students' perception of student-centered learning. And we see that by decision makers, by teachers, by students themselves, student-centered learning is never seen to have a barrier coming from students, which is not true, because very often from the fact that students are not ready to do this independent learning, they automatically start to oppose student-centered learning. And as the students from Maastricht University mentioned in their presentation, that you had the experience at Maastricht University and then you went to Asia. So you had this reflective thinking and you could identify the difference. But imagine if you would come from Asia into a student-centered learning environment, you would struggle so much because you just wouldn't understand what is it. And you would start opposing this new way of teaching and new way of learning. So this is a huge misconception, and it always puts troubles for students to get adopted to student-centered learning, and it creates frustration from those who are to implement student-centered learning. And then, in this paper, we just try to address and give recommendations on how we can actually overcome this. How can policymakers and decision makers look more comprehensively to the student experience, look more, understand in a comprehensive way that if student is not ready to be taught in a student-centered learning approach, then we need to think about that. We need to put ways and put tools in order to make student-centered learning a reality for students. And the misconception that student-centered learning is only beneficial for students should be overcome, because it's beneficial for the education system as a whole, and students need to have sufficient preparation in order to study with a student-centered learning approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Right now, we would like to hear Carolyn McDonnell, ideas and thoughts about student-centered learning.
Hi, like Gohar mentioned, I'm delighted to be here as well. My introductory piece is going to be a bit of a narrative, really. I actually started as a student in 1999, the year of the Bologna process. I did graduate in the meantime, but I've been involved in higher education in some form over the last 20 years. I've been a full-time student. I've been a lifelong learning student, a part-time student while I'm working full-time. I've been an online learner. I've studied through professional exams while working full-time with one lecture a month, and I'm a postgraduate researcher at the moment. So it's been really, I think I bring a unique perspective on how teaching and learning has been delivered over the past 20 years, because in some format or another I've always been involved as being a student. There was two things I'm here to talk about. We have Terry talking on the national level, and Catherine here is talking European policy level. Gohar is coming from the Students' Union's point of view. A lot of the conversations that we've had this morning and yesterday were very much conceptual ideas of directives, policy, and what does it look like from the top level, and how do we feed it downwards. So I will be talking a little bit around the institutional approach that's been taken in my own institution, and also from research that I've been doing over the past 2 years. Sorry, excuse me. Another thing I'd like to mention is I was one of the first student interns to work with Terry at the National Forum. And that afforded me an opportunity to capture the perspectives of all students in Ireland about teaching and learning and their experiences of it. So that's also something that I'd like to talk about this morning. So some of the opinions are not necessarily my own. They've come from a consultation that was done last December, where I worked with 7 different institutions and spoke to students from a variety of demographics, international students, postgraduates, undergraduates, full-time, part-time learners, and we also conducted an online consultation. So I would like to also be passing those perspectives on about different approaches to enhancing teaching and learning using that student-centred approach. And finally, my own piece of research looked at student-centred learning actually in a digital space, because when I started out my journey in higher education, technology was decidedly different than it is now, and technology has offered us so much and is a really, really useful tool for enhancing teaching. It doesn't replace the face-to-face contact, of course, but my own piece of research has looked at enhancing student-centred learning in a digital space. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well.
Thank you so much. Finally, we would like Catherine Isaacs to share her ideas.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to start by declaring my coordinates, which are, well, this was sort of shocking. Actually, I was a student once. I know this is surprising, but that was starting in 1961. And I was a very lucky student because on both sides of the Atlantic, I had intelligent professors who actually understood their role as being facilitators of learning. So that was a pleasant thing, and it's something maybe to remember, that some of this is in the DNA of higher education, if you can find it. And then, of course, as a professor, I tried to apply that to the extent I could. And when we started talking in a more systematic way about student-centered learning, of course, it became easier because it was more aware as a process. It was more, let's say, focused on what we were actually trying to do. But also, I was very lucky to be among the participants in developing ECTS. So that was 30 years ago, starting 30 years ago, and then in the tuning project, which is not often mentioned, although here we have some of the key members, including the coordinator of the tuning project, which actually developed tools for learning outcomes, for competence-based learning, for program learning outcomes, designing curricula, and aligning the learning, teaching, and assessment, aligning it, making sure that everything fits in its right place. And now, yes, I am the vice chair of the BFUG. I will be responsible for coordinating the drafting of the new communique, so this is very operational and concrete for me as an important area of discussion. I look at the current discourse on student-centered learning in a slightly skeptical way, because I see it often as something that gets pulled down from here or there, and then what is actually in it? That's a very good question. So I do have questions. I'm a true believer in student-centered learning. I'm a true believer in the fact that the student is at the center and has to be at the center of higher education. Who else, for the heaven's sakes? That input-based teaching, and that is preaching to people from a high podium, has definitely done it. It's over. That's not sufficient. We need something else, and we need ways of forming the competences that are the ability to deal with new problems, to interpret the learning that will be required in the future. And of course, it's not hence the transmission of existing knowledge, but the formation of the necessary competences to contribute to future society effectively, a changing, rapidly changing society. Now I'm going to shift my focus a bit. because I'm looking at whether student-centered learning, which is at the center, as we have said, of higher education today, can be, I won't say is, can be a unifying theme for our efforts in the Bologna process to develop meaningful dialogue at the global level. That means the European higher education area interacting in a positive way with the other macro regions that are also trying to organize similar processes. So, what was the beginning of the Bologna process? Well, when we go back and read everything, we can see where the DNA was, more clearly in the Sorbonne Declaration, to be honest, where it actually says that what we need is to create the conditions so that students, learners, can be mobile and can partake of the benefit of international mobility and learning. And so what does that mean? We had to find a standard, and what was the standard? The only possible standard that we could think of for putting into contact the radically different higher education systems that existed at that time was the reasonable possible time that a student can work in a year. And that was the original measure of ECTS. That's why ECTS, which is at the heart of the Bologna process, is student-centered at its heart. Because in contrast with other kinds of credit system that look at teachers, ECTS is student-centered, so it's already a beginning that nobody else had. The idea was that this would allow students to be mobile, to look around, to partake of different learning experiences, to create their own learning experiences, facilitated obviously by guarantees of excellence, of qualification, indications of agreed levels of higher education, qualifications frameworks. And now, of course, we have to look, and this is where I am, at whether this can somehow be brought into the global dialogue. In my view, what is necessary to make it work is generally agreed and qualifications frameworks that give us indications of level that we can reference around the world. We need, of course, we have the QF and the EQF, that's lovely, but we need to be able to put them into sync and into connection with the other such frameworks that exist around the world, putting them into contact, as we did with the European countries at the beginning of the Bologna process. And we have tools to do this now, I think. I think we have the tuning findings, which permit us to flesh out all this in a meaningful way. The most recent thing, the Kalohi project, has given us assessment reference frameworks for a number of subject areas. This is very, very important, and it helps us around the world. So, can this be an area that encourages global policy dialogue, that allows it? I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you, all the panelists. I think it's a very good background to start the discussion. And I would like to get back with Taylor Maguire and what you said. You mentioned students a lot and its importance, an important role in the whole student-centered learning process and implementation policies and so on. So how can you enable students to actually influence teaching and learning policy and practice at a national level?
The first thing you have to do is you got to talk with them. It's not rocket science. You've got to engage with them. You've got to partner with them. You've got to listen to what they say. And you actually have to listen, and then you have to negotiate a way forward. It's not about listening and going, yeah, but actually, I think this is the way we should do it. And I think sometimes that happens a little bit on the ground because it's custom and practice. The act of working in partnership is something that we all have to work at, staff and students. So one of the things that we did, I think, that was quite influential was we developed this, earlier I said we developed this Student-Led Learning Impact Award. So we wanted to students wanted to identify who they thought were the best teachers. We said, okay. And we said, okay, we'll do this. So what we decided to do was that the students, in partnership, we decided the students would identify their teaching hero, that one person that made a difference to them, and they would write 150 words about that hero in their nomination. So in typical fashion, we came down and we had some posters organized, and the students looked at it and went, I think these posters have been developed by a middle-aged male thinking this is what students like. And they were damn right, they were. So we tore up the posters and we started afresh. That was my first lesson. But what we ran it together, and as a national agency, our biggest issue was the trust that we place in our students. Every lecturer was saying, no, they're only going to put forward those students or those staff members who give them the best results. And the students, I remember sitting, and the student says, trust us. I said, okay, we'll trust you. And the first year, we got over 2,500 submissions for teaching heroes. And you know, if you actually did a word bubble around what makes a good teaching hero, care, time, and help. That's what the students value most. They were the words that came up most often when they started talking about their heroes. Yes, it was about giving courage. Yes, it was about real life. Yes, it was about engaging. But it was interesting, it was that personal dimension that came through very clearly. And that was our first partnership with students. And since then, we've learned to work with each other and to direct. So now this student-led award system is actually a key award system at a national level in Ireland. And students actually helped to build that, to frame it, to shape it. And what's interesting is that students picked out people within their institutions that weren't necessarily identified by their institution as being a teaching scholar or being good at teaching and learning. Because some of our teachers are very quiet about what they're doing very well in their classrooms. And when we went and interviewed those that were identified as teaching heroes, about half were teaching scholars. The other half reckoned the most important thing was your engagement in the classroom with your students, and they thought that scholarship was just gobbledygook. So I think the students have helped us to rethink what we actually mean about good teaching and rethink about what we value, certainly in Ireland, in our institutions. So that's how they've influenced.
Thank you. Actually, I think that it's a very good example on and good experience. How should it work, and how should all the collaboration between staff, academical staff, and students should work? And so, Gohar, what is the reality of the actual application of student-centered learning policies in other countries? Because right now we hear the good practices from Ireland. It's great, but what is the situation in other countries according to the students?
Thank you for that question. As mentioned about the Bologna with Student Eyes, we conduct this research paper, it's like a book, but we do it with the national student unions from all over Europe, and we try to understand so what's the students' perception about actual implementation of Bologna reform and key commitments, and within one of the chapters we look into particularly to student-centered learning. And there are many questions through which we try to identify whether student-centered learning is achieved or no to a certain extent. So when we look at a question, we have a question, are students consulted in your country in regard to the development of the curricula, which is one of the aspects if we want to see student-centered learning is achieved or no in a country. We see that like more than half of these respondents, which are from 39 European countries, more than half of them say that it's either not in place, so students are either not consulted, not involved anyhow into development of curricula, or it's just formal. So the formal representation of students is there, they are at the table, but there is no real meaningful discussions, there is no enthusiasm, there is no partnership between them as you want to see. So it's just formal presentation. And this is reality. This is what is the reality. Another thing that we are looking into is whether students are informed or they know at least what are the learning outcomes of their study program, what are the learning outcomes that they are aiming to get after a year or after 4 years or after whatever period they are studying. And again, we see that it's even like only 1/4 of the respondents say that yes, to a certain extent, students are informed about it, they know about it, and the rest just say that it's not in place. Students don't even understand what are the learning outcomes, what are they aiming to learn. And again, this is a very key indicator of having student-centered learning approach in place or not having it, because if the learner is not able to identify why and what he or she is aiming to learn, then the cognitive recognition of the learning process is not happening. So it means that you as a learner is not able to see the learning process as a whole, and you learn things here and there, but it's not a comprehensive learning, so student-centered learning is lacking again. And there are several indicators that we include into this publication, and we have it online, so that would be great if you will manage to go and look into it and see more precisely how we try to check if student-centered learning is in place in a certain country or not. I think that might be very, very helpful to reflect on the reality of the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline MacDonald, you said that you started your studies in 1999, right?
I do.
So with the beginning of the Bologna process. So in what ways has a student-centered learning approach impacted courses, content, and classes in your institutions that you were studying and in the institutions that you are working right now?
Okay, well, to answer that in a way, I suppose, one thing is important with student-centered learning is that staff and students are working together. It's not all about the door being open for students and then they make all the decisions. It's very much a partnership approach. So one of the Bologna directives impacted in Ireland is the development of teaching and learning departments within institutions. And I'm from an Institute of Technology, which is more focused on teaching rather than a research culture. So teaching and learning departments have been developed throughout the Institutes of Technology, and they are supporting staff to have a passion about their teaching, which, when this is done right, this impacts students. I think if we remember from yesterday, there was a time in higher education when audacity was completely frowned upon, but it's more welcomed now because it's important to be creative and innovative in terms of ways of teaching and learning. And just even give you one example, because I feel that my role here is to talk about how this looks on the ground. I'm a visual thinker. And I want a solid example of, how is this rolled out? It mightn't be necessarily useful for everybody in the room, but as a student, I can tell you this is one thing that worked for us. One of our lecturers, and also it was a research piece that was conducted, but one of our lecturers looked at feedback and the importance of feedback through assessment. And literature had indicated that oftentimes feedback is used by students, number one, for validation, for a job well done, or almost like a confrontation for a grade that wasn't achieved. So it was actually quite an emotional transaction between a staff and a student if there was face-to-face feedback given. And then looking again from a staff point of view, this can be quite resource-heavy, time-consuming if you want to meet every student face-to-face to give them meaningful feedback that they can use and take forward. So she used a process of oral feedback where when the assignment was submitted online, that she did a voiceover and went through the entire essay and gave feedback on specific pieces, and found that this process in itself was so useful in terms of what the student got back from it, because first of all they could replay the feedback, so there was more of a chance of them coming back to revisit what had been done. They look at grade, maybe there's a bit of emotion behind it, and it kind of negates any learning that they've got from the feedback they've received. But maybe revisiting it the second time and the third time, they began to see, well, actually, this is something I could have improved upon. There was also, I think from a national level, I conducted some research as well that indicated that actually students want to work in partnership with institutions. And like I said earlier, in terms of this audacity, sometimes there can be the power differential between a staff and a student is very much felt. That students maybe are afraid to be afforded or staff maybe are afraid to afford the opportunity to students to give them a little bit of ownership over their own learning, because nobody wants to fail. But in fact, at national level, some really interesting feedback that was received from students across Ireland was, actually, why don't we try some creativity? Why don't we try some innovation? And if it doesn't work, then we'll learn from that mistake together. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective, because it was kind of opening the door to this idea of partnership.
Thank you so much. Maybe some of the panelists would like to react to one of others' ideas. So then, Catherine Isaacs, you have tried to show the original inspiration behind the Bologna declarations. And it was to create agreed frameworks and tools which would allow students to design their own path through programs offered in their own or the other countries. This is one of the several facets of student-centered learning. 20 years later, during the Bologna process, do we still consider adequately this part of the equation?
Well, that is actually a question that I hope to be able to pose to the participants, because at times what we hear is that what was supposed to be a kind of freeing of the students' capacity to plan their own learning strategies, which also meant, of course, a degree of agreed structure so that they would know where they were going, what level, what was expected, and so forth. There seemed to have been a certain number of contrary happenings, such as some QA systems, which seem to limit the degree of variation that curricula, for example, can have for practical reasons from their point of view. So the question is whether actually this original inspiration of lowering barriers and creating transparency among systems so that students could have the benefit of international mobility, which truly we think is an important experience, and as someone said, real mobility, not only virtual, it's very important. Is this still in our sights or not? And I'm not sure, so that's something that I would like to know from the ground. My impression is that things have been often in some places become less free than we would have liked. And I will say that we are now conducting a Europe-wide consultation with in all countries and all stakeholders on the future of the European higher education area to 2030. And we have prepared, we've already done a consultation among the BFUG members, which means the 48 ministries and the 8 consultative members, organizations, European organizations, international organizations, and so forth. And the findings are basically that we think that very rapidly in the next 10 years and on, it will become necessary for students to be able to pick and choose rapidly and throughout their life bits of competence building at different levels And this is what higher education has to find out, whether it's able to offer or not, because this is what will be needed for people to adapt to this extremely rapidly changing world, needing new competences and needing to go and find out where to get them. So this means basically that breaking down the idea that you take one degree and then maybe another, and all the kind of learn more, earn more sayings that are around this, and will our frameworks and our understandings be adequate to address this future? Personally, I think we find the way because we have the tools in our hands, but this is something that has to be discussed.
You can react here.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting point, and I'm going to throw a complete curveball. When we're talking about student-centered learning, are we narrowing our vision for the future? Because the conversation at home now is looking much more holistically at the whole student educational experience. And this morning, if you look at most of our conversation, it's been about what happens in the classroom. But if you look in terms of what a student is experiencing in higher education, that's actually a very short time in their whole career, in their whole educational journey. And one of the things that one of the priorities for the National Forum now to the end of 2021 is to actually start rethinking this in terms of student success. And we had a think tank last week, a national think tank, that actually got staff and students to actually say, well, what are we talking about? Can we come to an understanding about student success? I mean, and it's, in a sense, it's everybody's business. So when we did the research with the students and about why students leave higher education, what we actually found out was that sometimes it had nothing to do with their course. It was to do with what was happening around their course. It was finances. It was the balance of work and schoolwork and life space. And you have to recognize this. So I wonder if we have an opportunity, right, to think a bit broader about what student-centered learning means and to actually maybe reposition it inside into the wider context of our student experience. And certainly that's what we're trying to do in Ireland. And I often ask my institutions, because I think if a student, we asked a lot of our students and they said, I have a very good academic degree, but I don't feel I was successful. I felt I actually survived despite the system. Now, what kind of an experience is that for our students? And I think we maybe need to rethink a bit and rethink about what would a finance office in a higher education institution that supported student success look like. Now, it certainly wouldn't say that's not the right form. Next, please. Or what would a registrar's office look like when a student comes in and they're thinking about leaving college, and the person there saying you have to fill in form CN 205. There you go. Just fill it in and hand it over. And that student has had no opportunity. They suddenly find that they've left college. Imagine a different kind of higher education institution where, yes, we had lots of student-centered focus in our classroom, but the rest of us was kind of student-centered as well.
I want to address your question. But before addressing the question, just to briefly say that, and then, well, they are connected to each other. So, in the Bologna with Student Eyes, we also try to see the reality with the student about the student-centered learning through quality assurance. So what we asked our national unions is to what extent the student-centered learning is present in the quality assurance frameworks in your countries. And we see that for around half of the respondents, like for 50%, it's either not present at all or present at a very, very low level. Then for around 30%, it's just around the average, and then the rest goes for a bit more than average above it. So my question to Terry is, because you spoke about more looking into all these different aspects that actually shape student-centered approach, do you think that the quality assurance is something that can help us to look into it, or if it's something that actually troubles us to look into student-centered learning.
Proceed with caution, is what I would say. Certainly, it was interesting. We did a big consultation with all our staff over the last 3 years about a professional development framework. And the one thing that was fed back from every single institution was saying, for goodness sake, make sure that the professional qualifications structure are not tangled up in the QA systems, because it will remove innovation and creativity, and it will become more a tick box exercise rather than something that we can build on. And I think that I support a quality assurance and enhancement approach where we're looking and we're trying all the time to be better. But a kind of a tick box, are you doing this? It's very easy to say you're doing something, but it can be very superficial. And I think if we're to do it meaningfully, we have to develop a culture of quality assurance and enhancement. And I'm interested in your response from your students on QA, because I know if I asked a lot of the Irish students about the QA systems, very few of them would know anything about whether or not it was actually incorporated into the policies.
Maybe someone else would like to react? So for this part, it will be last question, but I think that every one of you will have your thoughts. So in view of the Rome Ministerial Conference to be held in a year's time, the BFUG is organizing consultations on the future of European higher education area, focusing on the next decade, 2030, from 2020 to 2030. We imagine that higher education institutions will be under pressure to provide for new and rapidly changing needs. In particular, offering opportunities for developing new competencies through short or very short programs available for lifelong learning. Will we be able to respond in a student-centered manner to this challenge in the existing Bologna framework? Yeah.
Well, this is the question that I sort of tried to answer in my previous intervention. I think, and here going back to Fernando's question that wasn't really taken up in the last session, that is, what can we do to get over the generic mention of student-centered learning that appears in not only the communiques of the ministers at the ministerial conferences, but also in the statements of the Bologna Policy Forum. And next time in June, we will have a global policy forum, which we hope will be something quite different. But there too, the question is, and this is also a practical question, what is it that we can propose and work around to permit, enhance, facilitate, make better known, help the practice of student-centered learning. And I heard this morning about some guidelines and so forth. But consider, these ministerial agreements are agreements among ministers. And is it ministers that can do this, and how? How can they facilitate it? And do we want ministers to be telling us, yes, you must have student-centered learning in your system? Or is this really the responsibility of higher education institutions? Which is what I think, because I think that this is hands-on, this is students, this is teachers, this is stakeholders, this is graduates, this is teaching assistants. This is the nitty-gritty of higher education, so we need to have a framework that can help us, but this is the business of higher education, in my view.
What would be other thoughts? Because I am asking other panelists, because it's very important that next year can be like crucial year than when we will start the other decade of the Bologna process, and of course student-centered learning in that way. So what do you think, how student-centered learning will be through that other 10 years? How would you see that? How would you like to see that? Everyone. Yeah, you already answered, so it's the same question for all the others. Yeah, Terry.
I think I said it. I think it needs to be set in a wider context around student success. And I think it needs to be supported by policies that are enabling, that are implementable in practice, that are situated, that can be interpreted in local contexts, and that can really drive change on the ground. A lot of the work we've done, the actual policy context is quite inhibitory rather than supporting of any initiatives on the ground. And I think whatever comes out has got to be translatable for local priorities, local contexts, so that it can actually be implemented by staff.
Buhar, you also, during your ideas or thoughts, you mentioned some misconceptions of the student-centered learning. So during the next decades, what should and could and must be changed in student-centered learning?
Yes. But okay, I was thinking about something else. I wanted to react, but now that you asked another question. So, in regard to misconceptions, one of the and again, it's about looking to the student-centered learning as something more comprehensive and more overarching rather than just a simple method. So one of the things to overcome for all of us during the next decade is to start seeing student-centered approach to education rather than student-centered learning as a tool, let's say, next to digitalizing the teaching and learning, which has been a case. And in the article that we wrote, we do this analysis of some Bologna declarations and their drafts, where we see that in the drafts, student-centered learning is being mentioned next to other tools that can be incorporated into education, digital tools or other methods of teaching, and student-centered learning is just next to them, like one of them. So this is a thing that we need to change even at the policy level, at the discussions of the policy level, because we need to see student-centered approach as a whole towards education. And then it comes already to the practical implementation, as I mentioned, about misconceptions of how students perceive it, whether when we start to implement student-centered approach, is it something that we are pleasing the students, or is it something that we are actually teaching them the best way of learning? We are teaching them how to learn. And as I mentioned, at the first, when they just get adopted to this new way of teaching, it will be very hard for them. So we need preparation for them. We need comprehensive approach towards students in order to achieve full implementation of student-centered learning. And I also wanted to react to the previous question about whether it will fit, how will Bologna support the implementation of student-centered learning and what we can actually do. I think Bologna and all the declarations and all these platforms that exist for ministers, deputy ministers, or other people who hold policy-making power in the countries, Bologna has created an amazing platform for all of them to come together, which doesn't exist anywhere else. So all countries of European higher education area have this place to come and get these incentives to take back home with them. So I think the role of even considering to come up with certain criteria or, I don't know, guidelines that might at least highlight how we can look into student-centered learning and how we can look into how student-centered learning is being done or in this or another country. Bologna can be this incentive. It can give the incentive to the ministers, to the countries, to take back home with them and fit it into higher education system without taking any responsibility from the universities, without taking any academic freedom from them, but just to give them the incentive of how they can do the self-reflection of looking into implementation of student-centered learning and improve on that. Thank you.
Caroline, what would be your ideas for the future of student-centered learning?
For the future, I think, what I understand by your question is, what would student-centered learning look like in the future? And I think it's grounded in good communication because it needs to be flexible. There's no one-size-fits-all for a good, effective model for student-centered learning in terms of what a student gets out of it and how a staff can deliver it. On a national consultation that we did, we asked the question, what would enhance teaching and learning within your discipline? And we spoke to students who were doing Asian studies, business studies, social care work, and what they came back with was, on a spectrum, but one thing they said, placement enhancement. We want kind of a little bit more structure and support prior to placement, because putting us out into the big bad world after maybe 3 or 4 months preparation didn't prepare us for what it was going to be like to be there for 40 hours a week unpaid trying to learn on the job. But also within that they said things like field trips. I learned more on my one day walking around the courthouse than you could tell me from reading it from a book or doing some virtual exercise on a computer. So I think where student-centered learning it's in flexibility and it's grounded in good communication. So you ask the questions, you have the audacity to experiment with maybe some of the ideas that students are coming up with that are maybe a little bit outside of the box. There may be something that hasn't been used in your institution, or it might be an approach that has been frowned upon before, but when it's implemented, learn from the mistakes or learn from what's been done well.
Thank you so much. So right now we have around 30 minutes for the audience questions. So I will ask to be concrete and to say who you to address those questions. Of course, you can address the question to all the panelists. It's up to you. So now it's time for the audience. We don't see any hands. Yeah, I see a couple.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pedro Dominguinhos. I'm from Portugal, and I'm president of...
I think that, microphone doesn't work.
Lack of digital competencies.
Sorry.
Are you listening me? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. My name is Pedro Dominguinhos, and I'm responsible for Portuguese polytechnics in Portugal. Public polytechnics representing more than 100,000 students. And we are talking about a process of change in our institutions. And I totally agree that we should act at least at departmental level. And where is more difficult to act, both from the leadership perspective and from the students' perspective. So, and I want to ask, how can we, because we need involvement of the teachers, because a top-down approach is very easy, but will not function. So how can we evolve? And we need training for teachers. A lot of training for teachers. Of course, we need reward policies to reward these kinds of activities, because in most part of the cases, we are rewarding only research. And we are in several cases forgetting the teaching and the passion for teaching. So can you elaborate more about this involvement at departmental level? Because I don't know if it is the secret, but the curriculum design is crucial to implement this change that we are facing nowadays.
So I guess this question is for all the panelists. So who would like to start? Yeah.
So what we're doing at a national level, and I agree with the speakers this morning that we're very much viewing the discipline and the program as a unit of change. And we've set up a national award called the Delta Award, which is Disciplinary Excellence in Learning, Teaching and Assessment. And we work with disciplines and program teams to actually put together a plan for the enhancement of teaching and learning that works with students and with staff across the discipline. So in order to incentivize them, this year we have actually allocated funding. But the funding is targeted only to those disciplines that are willing to start planning the enhancement of teaching and learning. And because it's a national award, and there isn't a limit to them. Your planning and your approach to teaching and learning enhancement gets to a certain stage and you get the award. And then after 3 years, it's a micro-credentialization, a digital badge saying you're committed to teaching and learning. And after 3 years, in order to hold your actual badge, you have to take it's a light touch, you do it yourself, a self-evaluation of where the department or the program team is now at, and you submit that, you say, well, we've done our evaluation, and your badge gets actually done. Now, in terms of senior management, when we put this idea onto the table, about 3 years ago, the senior management said, why the hell would we do that? And this particular president that I was talking to had 30,000 students in their institution. And I went, well, I can think of 30,000 reasons why you might want to do it. Wouldn't it be good if your institution could actually has an actual stamp that says that each one of your departments in your schools are committed to the enhancement of teaching and learning? Well, they're now working on it, so he must have listened. So that's one of the ways. The other thing that we've done is, and I agree with you, that whole thing about promotional structures and the whole research and teaching and learning, we're not going to solve that in a small time. But what we can do is we gradually have to work away at it. So we have set up a professional development framework in Ireland. No, it's not compulsory for staff to do it. What we're trying to do is to encourage staff to move forward. They can engage with the professional development framework in any small or big way that they want. We're trying to take this very grounded approach and getting everybody moving forward a small way. And it seems to be working, but in order to get funding at a disciplinary level, in order to do that, we actually get them to, they have to engage with the professional development framework. So if you want all this funding to support what you're doing, you have to engage with the framework as well. And then finally, because it might be interesting, a lot of our disciplines are homegrown. I'm sure you have the same experience where we have postgraduates and lecturers that themselves have come up as students. And unless you get them opportunities to change the ideas that they actually have, to change the conversation, you're not going to get progress, you're not going to see new things. So we've joined up with our Erasmus Plus group in Ireland, and the Forum now sponsors Erasmus Plus scholarships, where we give recognition to teachers within disciplines that go to work with other universities and to bring back new ideas for teaching and learning enhancement and to disseminate across their disciplinary groups. And these have been quite successful just in getting some new ideas into those more sort of traditional discipline groups.
Thank you. I will ask the panelists also to be short, concrete, because I think that I totally understand that you have a lot of ideas and a lot of experience that you would like to share, but I think that we would like to hear more questions and more answers from you. So, and yeah, go hard.
I will try to answer to that question as of my own experience as a student, which I had at my university, and also what I have later seen as a European student representative at ESU. So when I was studying at my university in Armenia, and I was in the student movement, I tried to identify what type of teachers there are at my department that are teaching me. And I could see that there are 3 types of them. A group of people who are confident that they know everything, they have learned everything at their time, and now their only purpose to come to the class is to come and tell me the same thing so that I also learn that, and they don't realize that it's actually not a learning process, but it's just an information. They give me information, I either learn it or I don't, but that's their perception. Then there is second group of teachers who have managed somehow to do research to some good extent. They got this position to be a professor and come and teach. They are eager to learn and to do good teaching, but they are just not, they don't have the competency of doing the teaching, but they are open to learn. But the system, like the institutional system of their higher education institution, is not promoting enough for them to get more opportunities to learn. And there is third group of teachers who are excellent, who are very knowledgeable, who somehow managed to have different experiences outside of their main institution. They have managed to develop their pedagogical skills and knowledge, and they do really good teaching. So I think when you look into how to do this change at the department level, it's really important to identify these three groups of teachers and understand what's the combination that you need to put these teachers together in order for them to help each other, in order for them to change each other and to support each other. And an important part here comes to the dialogue between both teachers and also with students. So from the institutional perspective, the decision making should go in a direction to try and identify how you can give incentives for the departments to make this internal cooperation within themselves and with their own students from their own faculty. And there are certain examples from some universities where the cooperation between the students and the teachers worked so well. So, and also, as Mania mentioned in her speech about having assistants, student assistants from either graduate or undergraduate level, it's very helpful to create this this perspective of cooperation, so that even those teachers who are very much against any changes, they see that it's something useful, and then they start to shift to that. And then another thing that is very much important when you already try to identify how the changes within the department and in relation to the teachers are going, it's important to have proper student feedback about teachers in place. So students should be there to give individual feedback about their own teachers, and the analysis of this feedback will give a clear picture about how the development and improvement within the department is going. Thank you.
Yeah, microphone, please. Yeah.
One thing I did not mention, but probably should be mentioned, is that in the BFUG we do have a working group on teaching and learning, which actually says teaching and learning, whereas usually we try to say learning and teaching these days. But in any case, we imagine that there will be recommendations in a concrete way to move beyond what Gohar was mentioning, which is student-centered learning as one of a series of things, as if they all had the same weight.
Caroline, would you like something to add?
Well, from what I understand by the question was that how do you sell the idea of student-centered learning to an institution who maybe is fixated on a certain way of being? Would I be correct?
I think he was talking about teacher training.
Oh, teacher training for yourself.
Yeah. Can you give the microphone to the...
Oh, okay. Well, I suppose for teacher training, I think, one thing, we're all here today because we're actually interested in teaching and learning and looking at ways that we can share practice together and knowing where policies and directives come from. And I think, if we're looking at teacher training, we look at the models around what motivates people to maybe want to engage professionally and progress professionally, and what are the incentives that are there behind it. And, it's a difficult question. I can't answer it.
So we have one more question to the back, back.
Thank you very much. Vera Zabotkina, Vice Rector from Russian State University for the Humanities. First, I'd like to thank for this very important process of disambiguation of ambiguous concept of student-centered learning. Thank you. And I'd like to build on what Catherine Isaac just mentioned, that one of the best answers to the challenge of student-centered learning is tuning project, tuning methodology. And I'm happy that Robert Wagoner is here, the author of tuning methodology. But you mentioned dialogue. We need global dialogue regarding student-centered approach. But question, don't you think that there should be a dialogue between the student and the teacher, a proper dialogue? And from the cognitive point of view, it should be interactive alignment. It's a cognitive term. That means that student and the teacher should have approximately the same representations of the thing discussed. It's impossible to have the same identical representations in our heads. At least we should strive for this alignment with the students' representations, and the students should strive for this interactive alignment with our teachers' representation. Don't you think this is important? And of course, the concept of dialogue means it's not always consensus. It's sometimes clash of opinions, and we should also understand that modern education, well, it was mentioned yesterday, should be III, international, intersectoral, interdisciplinary, and intergenerational. So there will always be this gap, generation gap, but we should strive for intergenerational, interactive alignment. Don't you think so? Thank you.
Catherine, yeah, it was the question addressed to you.
Well, thank you for this question, or this realm of questions. Of course, I think dialogue is absolutely fundamental. I think in the alignment, we understand in the first place as something so simple, but so often ignored. Because in the first place, we consider, well, if you set up certain learning outcomes, if the learning process that's supposed to happen is organized in a certain way, is the way you've organized it aligned to your objective? Are the competences you plan to be formed, will they be formed in this way? Is this the best way to form it? Is it the best way to use the students' time? How are you going to know this? Well, maybe you better talk to the students. That's a very good idea. And also, students do need to have the idea of what map has been prepared for them in some way and be able to interact with it critically as well. But we all have seen that it's very important for the student to understand what is supposed to be the benefit of whatever experience we have tried to organize for them, because this makes it totally different, because then you become a facilitator, a planner, an organizer, a protagonist of your own learning, which is fundamental. And I remember perfectly well as a student, you think, well, I'll do what they say, more or less, but without really realizing that you are the one that has to benefit by all this. And then, fundamental, just to finish this entree into the tuning world, of course, assessment, and here we've seen so many practical examples that are almost ridiculous. Assessment has to assess what you were trying to form, and often it doesn't. And I've seen dramatic examples of this, people that were doing all sorts of wonderful things, and then the assessment was an essay with no feedback. Goodbye. Has nothing to do with the competences that were to be formed. So having this alignment and dialogue and understanding of our responsibilities of all of us in this process, I think is fundamental. There'd be a lot more to say.
So yeah, we have one more question. It will be the last question because organizers telling that time's up. So yeah.
My first question, my name is Amanda Murphy. I'm from the Center of Higher Education Internationalization at Università Cattolica in Italy. My first question is, who is this genius who is reproducing student-centered learning on an incredible board here? Is he a student? Because I'd like him to be my graduate assistant, if so. I don't know if everybody's seen this, but it's really quite amazing. I just wanted to pick up on this idea of dialogue and the question about what does student-centered learning mean, because it seems to me perhaps we should be adopting the lifelong learning paradigm in the sense that somebody said, you know, that the life of a student is extremely short. And what we're talking about here is a totally different, a shift in a paradigm. Everybody should be looking at the learner rather than at the teacher. But speaking as somebody in university, it seems to me that we don't have any training at all, at least in Italy, to understand this process. And I'm just wondering, I mean, Catherine mentioned a wiki on teaching and learning. I think one of the things that would be really interesting here is for sort of international information points to be pointed out. If we could go home with some information of where we can learn more about this huge shift in a paradigm, which in a sense we should already know about because Bologna happened in 1999. But I can certainly say in my institution, it's trickling down now. I mean, we are having to look at what it means to, you know, concentrate on student-centered learning 30 years later. I don't know whether that's a clear question.
So to who you address this question?
Well, Catherine was the person I started from. I think that the lifelong learning paradigm is an interesting one, but at the same time, are there points of information where, you know, we can take information home to our colleagues about how do we shift to this paradigm?
If I will try to be brief, that is a competence, I think. But anyway, I think there is a lot of material out there, and I've also seen some very interesting projects in Italy. For example, the Sapienza had one that involved all their departments, which at that time were 80, and having the teachers actually work in 4 groups to develop curricula and develop the learning and teaching and assessment methodologies. So there are examples. Obviously, all the material which is on the Tuning Academy site can be very useful. University of Bologna, I see Carla back there, can give you a lot of pointers of where to find this material, and I, of course, will be very happy to do that. But it does pose the problem, is there a way for us to make this material more evident and more available? And, well, I take it on board.
Maybe any last words from any panel? Yeah.
I actually think that having the material is a really good idea, but it's a conversation you have to have in your own context. You have to start the conversation and explore what does it mean for you in your department, within your institution, and I think you should work from there.
I think this is the perfect sum up of this discussion, and thank you, panelists, thank you, the audience.